Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming by again to see us on The Avid Reader. Our guest today is Michael Bible, author of The Ancient Hours, published in December by Melville House. Michael's previous novels are Sophia and Empire of Light. And he studied at university under the mentorship of Barry Hannah, which must have been a great privilege. The Ancient Hours kind of tricks us into thinking one thing in the beginning. What I'm telling here may sound like spoilers, which I normally, of course, wouldn't do, but since the New York Times did, well. So we meet some middle-aged men, theoretically innocent, remembering something that affected all of them in a transformative and tragic manner to an event back in the beginning of the century that shook them to the core. We think maybe they'll be recounting the event sitting around the restaurant table, and that'll be the setting of the novel, which would have been fine. But that isn't the way it's to be. We're taking ourselves back to the past and to the day of that event, which resonates with us and forms the sphere around which our characters resolve. So closest to that sphere is Iggy, the perpetrator of the conflagration. Again, I normally wouldn't say this, that leads to the death of more than a score of residents in the town of Harmony, North Carolina. Iggy narrates the most intense part of the book, where he awaits execution, writing a story that may never well be seen, except it is, by us. So welcome, Michael, and thanks for stopping by today.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
So I guess the easiest way to start is tell us a little bit about Iggy, because in doing so, you'll tell us a lot about the book.
Yeah, Iggy is, he's a young man who I think has a very troubled childhood and is looking for some transcendence, something that will take him out of the small town that he's living in. And he seeks that in relationships, and he seeks that in, a kind of escapism. And he isn't very lucky in life. And this drives him towards this horrific incident, which is self-immolation. He's inspired by the Buddhist monks who would, in protest to war and various other things, light themselves on fire. And he does this in a church one Sunday morning, and instead of having its intended effect, it burns the church down and traps 25 people inside. And he's eventually caught and arrested and executed for his crime. And we follow the story of not only maybe why he did this or what caused him to do it, but also what effect it has on the citizens of this town and of the church that he lives in.
And the other thing about it is, I remember seeing the pictures of those Buddhist monks immolating themselves during the Vietnam War and stuff like that in protest. Right. And it's like, at first, when you think about it, it's hard to believe that someone can get to that point in their life. But a lot of the thread of the story is how Iggy does get there. And it starts out perhaps in his childhood and exacerbated by the people who are in the lunchroom talking, in the restaurant at the very beginning. But in your mind, and I think about it too, how does one get to that point where one, your only release is death, and two, you're only release.
Yeah, I think, right. I think I've thought about this question a lot. It's a tough thing. I think there's a line in the book where he says, you asked me why I did this. It's as if you take a handful of water and question, is it river or rain? And I think that is kind of an encapsulation of what I was trying to think about. How does that exact question you pose? How does a person get to that point? And I think how a person gets to that point is the fire is behind them. what they're facing behind them is so terrible that leaping out the window is the best option. That whatever terror is chasing them, ending their own life is the only escape from that. And then the second part of the question becomes equally as important, is then why in this way? Why not just do it alone, take your own life and spare these other people, which in a way you might argue was his intention, but maybe he didn't think that through, or obviously still culpable in some way. But I think that problem is it's not necessarily a modern one, but it's come into focus, I think, recently, with mass shooting events, with terrorism, with these lone killers, mass killers. I think there's a deep and probably too complex pain in them that they only feel will be remedied by inflicting pain. That's about as close as I can get to it. And the other part of it is, I think it's maybe unknowable exactly what the full ramifications of that question are, because I think if you took Iggy on a certain day and a certain time and changed any one thing, maybe he would have turned out differently. Or maybe you could have taken him back and put him through the exact same things that he went through, and he still wouldn't have done it. I think we're all faced by different choices, both a sort of nature versus nurture kind of thing, but there's also the fluidity of life and how our presence of mind at any one point at any one day could cause us to do something like that. And I think I wanted to explore where the line between this kind of horrific act is and everyone else walking around on the street. And so that's partly why I wanted to bookend, in a way, Iggy's story and Joe Cloud's story at the end of the book, and sort of show them as these parallel characters.
Yeah, it's funny. There does seem to be a devaluation of life, whether it's because of social media or whatever it might be. But it's almost like, and the reviews suggest it too, is even when he's in prison awaiting his fate, he seems to have a very matter-of-fact attitude, as if he's almost reciting things from a distance, as if sometimes I do, like there's a commentator watching myself, but really doesn't care that much. Either no sense of remorse, or kind of like the movie and the book, The Man Who Wasn't There, or even like Holden Caulfield, who recites things like, okay, it's just like, it's almost as if life is something that is there, but it doesn't really hold any value. It's like if you go to a casino and you start betting blackjack, and you're betting $5 chips, and you do well, so they're $25 chips and $100 chips. Then if the bartender comes, the bar girl comes by and you get your drink, you just throw her $100 chip.
Right.
You would never do, but money has lost its meaning. It's not money anymore. It reminds me of that a little bit.
Yeah. I think also it's our relationship to time as well. They talk about in psychology also, I think it's sort of blended into like behavioral economics and things like that, but the experience of time. You might go on a trip, right, and your plane is delayed and you have to sit there for 8 hours, and those 8 hours tick by like at a glacial pace, that you just can't get on that plane fast enough. It's just terrible. But then you go to Mexico for the weekend and you're there for 24 hours and it goes by just like that. And then what happens is, in your mind, maybe at that moment, that you're waiting for 8 hours to get on the plane seemed forever. But then 10 years later, you don't even remember waiting for the plane, but you remember going to Mexico, and it seems as if it were a month long, right? And I think that's something that our minds do as we grow older, as we have more distance from a certain event. Things build and change. And I wanted to kind of explore that in every chapter, in the beginning, these kind of innocent men, the chorus. I think I don't know where you grew up, but in the small town that I grew up in, and a lot of the small towns I've visited, you could go to a diner, wherever, and there's always a group of men old men at about 3 o'clock, drinking coffee at wherever this place is in the town, sort of recounting, I always thought, the history of the whole town over and over again. But even they have a relationship with the past and this event that changes as they grow older, and so in a certain sense, the event itself has changed because they are perceiving it quite differently. And I think, maybe that's similar to something that Holden Caulfield has. I mean, he's so deeply alienated that he can have a kind of distance towards these events or these people. Or maybe Holden is, in a sense, not being honest about his real feelings, and maybe Iggy isn't either, in a certain sense, that kind of coldness or nearly reportage of the events without really reflecting on them is a coping mechanism for him to try and order the events in his mind. And I was struck. I'm a very a big opponent of the death penalty, and a lot of readings that I had, it was strange to read how people would experience death row, particularly the final days, and a lot of them couldn't wrap their mind around it and still feel like they had time after this event. And I think that's something that's universal. We sort of pretend that thing is not going to happen to all of us, and some people just know the date and the time of it. So anyway, yeah, maybe I didn't answer your question exactly, but I think that experience of time, just like you're saying, the experience of getting money in a casino or something, the value of it changes, right, depending on your relationship to it.
And the other thing is like, well, there were two things. I'll remember. I got to write it down. The other thing is like, I used to have this book in the bookstore called Last Meals of Texas.
Oh yeah, I know that book. Yeah.
And everyone loved that book. And I think, why do you love it for? But then when he says pulled pork sandwich in a bottle, not a can, of Dr. Pepper, it's like, yeah, I wouldn't mind having that. Exactly. But it's like, okay, there you go. I mean, it's like that has enormous value, but it's nothing. But at the very end, it has enormous value in your life. Yeah. Or thinking of last words, or, I don't want the priest, I don't want the lawyer, there's all these things that you're deciding at the very end that normally, it's a pulled pork sandwich.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes, yeah, exactly. And that matters so much. But I think, the inverse is true as well. When we're children, things seem so important and intense and revelatory and transcendent that then later don't seem to matter much at all. And I think that Iggy, in a way, is stuck in that childhood. He's stuck both in the moment that he's in, approaching his own death, but also in this kind of prelapsarian world that he was in with Paul and Cleo. So I think, yeah, it's a strange thing how the stakes kind of raise and lower depending upon where you're entering a story. So yeah, it's really fascinating.
That's the other thing, is that like these people, you think, okay, he's bad, but he's not bad. And Cleo and Paul too, they have their flaws, but no one is really, I don't mean evil, I just mean bad. They're just people. And they go through the same things that I would go through or you would go through. They may take different actions. I mean, especially like, Cleo later on, what happens to Paul. It's like these characters affect him greatly, and especially because their relationship is like a triad.
Uh-huh.
But we don't look at them, or at least I didn't look at them. Normally, when you're reading a book, you're looking at the character and he's a hero, he's a villain, those kind of things. There weren't heroes or villains. Just like the reviews talk about your chorus, your Greek chorus at the outset, the first words of the book are, we were innocent.
Right.
Were they? I don't know. I don't.
No. Right. Not at all. Yeah. I think that, yeah, that's another point in the book. There's a line that says, harmony is a town full of saints and sinners that you can't tell apart. And I think I really wanted to think about that idea a lot. All of the books that I love tend to blur that line between hero and villain. And I'm interested in how we can see each other more fully as people. And I think literature helps us to see behind people's skin a little bit and see what they're going through and recognize them as more than just, the sum of their actions or, one moment in their lives. I think that's something that I've kind of come back to over and over again in writing is, judging someone for one day or 1 hour of their life. It's a very anti-human thing because we know better. We know that we're driven by all sorts of conflicting ideas and we are pressed upon by moments in our lives that affect us deeply. And I think, there is no binary there which is what the church wants to put on it, I think. And that one reviewer, I think, was right to point out that the opening of the book, we were innocent, is meant to almost come off as ironic. Clearly, these people are not, and that the finger we should be pointing is not necessarily at the perpetrator of these actions, and nor should we completely say that the victims are always innocent either. Not that they deserve any certain thing or don't, but that they have lead complicated lives as well. And that if there's anyone that we should, that needs to be redressed or needs to kind of take stock of their viewpoint are the people sitting in the pews or the people sitting at the diner in the town who kind of sit in judgment of these actions and these people. And that, as I think taking that to a bigger spectrum, as a country, we kind of sit back and look at these tragedies happen and kind of scratch our heads and go, well, what can we do if we change this here around the edges? And I think it's that we really have to take stock of what's happening to these people and how they're being alienated, and seeing each other fully is the only way to do that.
Yeah, we haven't been doing it, and today we're talking kind of a special day today.
Yeah, it's strange to talk. Yeah,
I know. You and I are actually missing it.
Right, I know. I felt a little bad, like I didn't know if you.
I know. So did I. I didn't know I didn't think about it when we did it.
We'll catch the recap.
Yeah, right. There'll be plenty of times. It's funny because one of the things you do that is exactly the same, but it doesn't deal with the person, it deals with the town. At the beginning, you say Harmony is this wonderful place, and you tell the little homie stories, and then you go, no, it's not really. This is what really happened back then. And that also does the same thing. It says, obviously what you see is not what you see is not really what's there. And that's true of every character.
Right. And I think true of places too. I think we're often kind of sold a picture postcard version of a place, or sort of the bright qualities of any given town are shown first. But I think there's I find small towns to be some of the darkest places around, and particularly in the South, that you really can't walk too far without kind of conjuring blood from the soil. It's a very mysterious and gothic kind of place. But and it's a place that I've struggled to understand. And I think that's probably true for a lot of America. There's a lot of undigested history, probably too much to go around, I think.
Yeah, and that's also part of what's happened in the past 4 years too. The other thing is that I think is very important, and I am not going to spoil it, is that what happened in the church isn't what Iggy was planning. That's not, I mean, it seems like, okay, this is what happened, but you make it very clear, although the readers might easily forget it, is that he didn't intend this result at all.
Right. And I think I was trying to complicate the picture of him even further. I think you hear the headline on the news, and you kind of think one thing, but the story is always much more complicated. Iggy is a conglomeration of a lot of different characters and a lot of both true life and imagined details of these people. But there's every time I would research any one of them, there's always a much more complicated picture going on. So in that final moment, I wanted to have that same ambiguity, that same complication.
Yeah, and you bring it out really well with the matches,
Right.
It's like chance, then it happens. It could have been something different if someone didn't come out and do something. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, that was, I think, kind of pivotal. It was pivotal.
Yeah.
Then if you move on, I mean, okay, that's Iggy, and then we can talk more about, talk about it now. When he writes down, like I said in the introduction, when he writes down, he's not necessarily expecting that anyone's going to read it. But since we know what happened. And it's just luck that we chance upon this semi-memoir that wouldn't exist otherwise. And that's something that's done in a lot of books. But the thing about it is that even when he writes that, you're expecting at some point, I was expecting at some point, that he would express more remorse at what happened or why it was a mistake and how it wasn't what he expected to do. But he's at the point where like we said earlier, it doesn't really matter to him. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I think it's something harkening back to what we were talking about earlier, that the experience of time and how it changes depending on how you're looking at it and with what stakes and what where in your life you're looking back on your life. And it's something I want to, maybe we'll talk about Cloud a little later, but he also has that quality where that's how trauma works in a strange way. It's not always that, this Hollywood version of maybe the soldier in bed having, night helicopters in Vietnam and that sort of kind of thing. It comes back to you in much stranger ways you're not really always expecting. And, in the last chapter, there's a sort of transference that Cloud, this person who you could say lost, so much, probably lost more in the fire than anyone. And yet he's not focused on that day. He wouldn't think about that day. He wouldn't know much about that day. And so he's transferred it and memories of his mother into this other kind of ghostly person that comes into his life that he tells, this kind of surrogate. And similarly, Iggy does the same thing. He's sort of transferring the memories or his culpability or his, what he needs to atone for into these trying to kind of put it down, get it out, as a kind of report, his version of the story, his defense, if you will, of what he did. But I think ultimately what he arrives at is, I don't know. And that's a difficulty that every human being has to face, that we don't always know why we do things. We're sort of the least aware of our own actions sometimes. So yeah, there's that kind of distance I think I tried to put in both sections.
Then if we move on to the other characters, if we move, say, to Cleo, initially I thought Cleo's like, okay, she knows what's going on. She's funny. She's on the edge. She has an insight into Iggy's personality that he doesn't even have. And you think certain things about where she'll end up, but she doesn't end up where I thought she would end up. I expected a different life for her than the life she experiences. But at the beginning, she does seem like, well, she seems really cool, right?
Yeah, and I think, she's kind of I always hesitate to try and put adjectives on. It's what I think we would call, when I was growing up, like a punky kind of girl, and artistic. And you think, all right, this is the trajectory she's going to go in. Very open and sort of blindingly energetic. But I think that's that's something that happens with time too, is that people don't always achieve the things they wanted or see through it, and they get trapped in other situations of either by convenience or escaping something, which is what happens to her. I'm always wary of when or if to put spoilers in, but I think sometimes, I don't much care for that. I think sometimes, or at least some way that I was trying to organize the book was that the spoilers wouldn't necessarily be the events. It would be the suspense of the narration, that you would kind of be, the next chapter would come and you wouldn't know, well, it wasn't the same narrator from chapter to chapter. So you would kind of have to get oriented to where you were. And that disorientation sort of mimics the disorientation of each of the characters. And so I sort of wanted to kind of mimic that in a way. But anyway, to wrap up Cleo, I think she's, again, reacting to her own circumstances and trying to find the best way out of her circumstance, which is pregnant and in some way associated with the person that has done this horrific act, and goes on the run and ends up in a cult situation, and then escapes from that. So yeah, that's Cleo, I think, sort of in a nutshell.
Well, then if we do that and we go to like this triangle. So we talk about Paul, Paul's an important character, but he's not like pivotal, but he takes the story and moves it along. So that leads me to the sexuality and the sex in the book, which is really well done, but is not conventional. And I think in part you meant it to lead to what happens to Iggy, but also it's just some kind of, I don't know, interesting story about how people interact with one another unconventionally. And it's a small town, they've said it in the reviews, here's a small town, but it's simmering and smoking under, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I don't know, man. I think it's sort of funny. I kind of think about, Southern writing is like a town in and of itself, and you sort of have these different neighborhoods, and there's a Faulkner neighborhood, and maybe a Carson McCullers neighborhood. I think that part of the book is maybe the Tennessee Williams part of the neighborhood. It's kind of that sort of that strip, that alley, and I think it's something that happens in small towns where people that are different cling to each other like a lifeboat. And I know it happens in the gay community for sure. But I think of every persuasion sometimes that, like, sexuality blends and is shaded. And these three characters kind of end up together on this life raft. But obviously it's short-lived.
Yeah, and I'm always thinking that I'm thinking, okay, I'm reading in the present, this is now, but it wasn't now at all. It was a time before any of that really actually happened.
Sure. Yeah. Right. And I think that's an interesting story over the past 20 years too. That was something that I kind of wanted to capture, that, in a way, trying to tell a story of America without ever talking about national politics or, big news events, or, that was another sort of kind of ghostly presence in the book that I was by putting certain dates on it. It was that we kind of understand that even though we're living through this time, I mean, you and I are talking right on a inauguration day, and you're like watching television, and these things are going on, but our lives also have things that are more important to us personally going on too, and maybe things locally that are going on that affect us more. And so I think for these characters, these are the events that live most in their eyes. But it's also a charting a sort of trajectory of what our country went through, so sort of post 9/11 to through Trump, kind of up until last year, which I think is going to be an interesting 2 decades to study.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, that's the other thing, you talk about time, and we talk about things changing in terms of value, and it's become such a cliche, but when this happened and I woke up one morning and Donald Trump is president of the United States, I've hated him since like 2007. And then in the debates and all that, it was also like, and I have this colleague at the bookstore, Mike, and every day we'd be saying, you couldn't write this stuff down. But the problem is that became such a cliche that you couldn't say it anymore.
Right.
It was so far beyond, you couldn't write this stuff, that there wasn't any expression we could use anymore that explained what was happening.
Yeah.
As late as this morning, him taking his plane off, and it's just also, and the pardons, it's just, no, you couldn't write that down. No one would buy the damn book.
Right. Well, and I think that's exactly what we were talking about earlier too, is this like fraction of time. Like there will be things that like we could talk about. I mean, thinking about any one of these like main events. I mean, do you remember? I mean, like he was on SNL. Do you remember that he hosted SNL? That was 5 years ago. Do you know what I mean? Like that seems like it was 20 years ago or something. Like our understanding of time, because of all these events and all this, maybe trauma is a correct kind of word. I think a psychic kind of, thing that we've had to negotiate for all this time, to suddenly be like released of that is a very strange thing. But you're right. Like we will think of this time differently, as it seeming longer maybe than it actually did. That's such an interesting phenomenon to me.
The whole thing. I mean, first of all, they should be ashamed that they put him on there. And this whole idea of humor, whether it's Stephen Colbert or Jimmy Kimmel or Jimmy Fallon, joking about it is not effective. To the point where joking about it is silly, because one, it's not funny anymore at all. Because what he does is, you can't, as everyone has said, you can't satirize it. It's beyond satire.
Right.
And I don't know what my point was, but I did have a.
It's an uncanny kind of time. It's strange. It's almost unbelievable, absurdist. It's crazy.
Yeah, and that is the thing, is that it's unbelievable, and people write books that you go like, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to read this. This could never happen, and it's silly.
Right.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I would just toss it.
Yeah.
Which is what we've basically done, and especially last week. I mean, it's like kind of a conspiracy theorist, and it's like the plane hitting the Pentagon. there's so many reasons why it couldn't have possibly happened that when you do like Occam's razor or something, it's like, okay, well, if there's so many reasons why it couldn't have happened, it didn't happen. And it's like the Capitol. It's like, there's so many reasons why they shouldn't have been able to do what they did. It's impossible.
Right.
And then they did it. So where am I?
Yeah, I think that's something that's also stretched over the last 4 years is like what were that sort of window of like possibility. You're right. You like I never would have thought that was even a possibility. Like, of course, in our minds we go, well, you can't just get a bunch of people and walk up there, knock the windows down and walk in. Like that can't happen, but it can, of course, and. Yeah, it's such a wild time. Yeah.
And then back to your book or back to writing in general, if you wrote that, your reviews would be horrible because it would like be this, how did you get to this point? You're not setting it up properly.
Right.
It doesn't go from this spot to this spot. How are you going to fill the gap? And they would criticize you roundly, right?
Right. Yeah. I saw a writer, Richard Price. Is that his name? He wrote Clockers. He wrote.
Yeah.
Is that him? I saw him read once, and he said, "God is a third-rate novelist," and I think that's very true. Is that if you wrote the things down as they happened, people wouldn't believe you. It just, you have to make it different. You have to kind of put the imagination in it, or yeah.
Yeah, and the thing is, 1/3 of the people in the world love that third-rate novel, and it's just like I always ask my brother. I go, and I'm being so naive. I go, how the hell could this happen? How do these elections? Why are they so close? And he goes, because half of Americans are like this, and half of Americans are like this.
Right.
It's so hard for me to accept that. It's really hard. It's whether it's a movie or a book. It's this forced suspension of disbelief, but it's really happening.
Right. Right. Yeah.
We're not selling any of your books doing this.
No, I know. That's all right. They're solving the world maybe a little, yeah.
But it is on my bookshop, Wellington Square Bookshop. Yeah, it is on the front table. And
I wanted to ask you how the bookshop. I used to be a bookseller in Mississippi, and so I love bookstores, and I'm always wondering how it's been through 2020.
You would like my bookstore. It's one of those COVID paradoxes because we've done better this year than we've ever done. And it's like there's so many things that we didn't know. I didn't know that Ingram would drop ship to anybody, so we get all these online orders.
Oh, wow.
And then we're only open like 4 days a week still now, and we're making twice as much each day or more. And then the 3 days we're not open, I don't have any overhead. So it's like
that's very, yeah, that's very funny. You're not the first kind of small business that I've talked to. I have a buddy that owns a record store in Mississippi, and he said the same thing, that he'd gotten orders from all over the country, and figured out a lot of distribution things that he didn't really understand before. So I wonder if there will be a kind of new page where independent bookstores will be able to compete a little more sharply with Amazon, because you've kind of had this year of shipping and are sort of, people still want to support your bookstore and visit your bookstore in a way virtually and sort of get your recommendations and see that as important. I don't know.
Plus it's a bookstore, so there's never really more than 10 people in it anyway.
Right.
So that's good. And they feel, it's like things you do that make you feel good. And there's not a lot of things like that. Going to Whole Foods maybe not Whole Foods, but going to a supermarket doesn't make, it doesn't make you feel good. Whereas going to a bookstore, at least for me and for you too, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's true too. It's like, I really do thrive and live on those recommendations. I mean, like, I'm very, very blessed living in New York City. One of the best things about it that I love. I mean, it's been a difficult year because we're sort of stuck in this place with all this rich culture that we can't go to. And one of the big pieces of that is being able to walk into a bookstore and walk up to an employee and say, what do you think I like this, I like this. What do you think I should get? And just taking that recommendation and kind of having people that you return to and building those relationships like they're a bartender or something almost, they kind of know where you are in your life, and they've got the book for you. So I'm not, I'm excited to come back to when this is all sort of over the hump of vaccines and things. But yeah, I mean, I value that more than anything. And so I have virtually done that this past year, to visit various bookstores that I like. And you guys are outside of Philadelphia.
Yeah,
maybe
yeah, I guess I am tooting my own horn, but we've gotten best bookstore in the main line, best bookstore in Philadelphia, best bookstore in Pennsylvania, and Atlas Obscura call us one of the 62 best bookstores in the world. And I have no idea why they would possibly say that, but we still got it. And the other thing about bookstores is there's the arbitrariness of it also. Like Amazon's going to give you recommendations of books they think you'll like because you probably will like them. But when you go up on my library letters, which is another dream I've always had, is having library letters, is when you go up there, you can find the book you want, but you also see the book on either side, which you don't know anything about. And you like the cover or whatever, and you just grab it. And that's the book that like be a life changer, right? Especially for kids.
Absolutely. Kids. Absolutely. Yeah. And also, I think there is a kind of literature that I like. I was a nerdy English major kid. I wrote poetry and I diagrammed sentences, and I everything about that I enjoyed. But there was a point in my reading life, and I think it was sort of like late in high school, early college, where people would kind of go, you would read whatever you're reading in class, but then you started to discover like, oh, there's this whole other subculture of authors that they're not going to teach you at school. And that kind of underground economy was very located at a bookstore. Somebody going, you like that? You really should read this. This is the guy that they're not going to tell you about in your 12th grade English class. So that's also an invaluable sort of.
Yeah, and I have great people and each of them like different genres. So that's even better. So it basically is a curated bookstore. Isn't it funny how when you're going to college and you're maybe majoring in English literature, that you get all A's because you read the book, and then they give you a test, and so you answer. But all my friends would be reading Cliff Notes or Spark Notes, and I'd go, just read the book. I mean, it's easy to read the book, and then of course you're going to get an A because it's really simple.
Right. Yeah. I remember thinking that too. Like when I was in college, we had to take a big comprehensive exam at the end of it, and I was an English major, and I remember taking the test going like, did I just get away with this? Like this wasn't, how did, like they let me read books for 4 years and then write a big paper about why I liked them. I mean, this wasn't an exercise in, this was, I would have, done a lot of things in order to get to do that, and would do that now,
My favorite one was the James Joyce Ulysses Honors seminar that I took, because you kind of had to get an A because no one really understood it anyway. Right. Not as bad as Finnegan's Wake, but it's like, you did the best you could. And if you get something out of it, the professor was pretty happy. So that was.
Yeah. Did you read Finnegan's Wake in the class?
Yeah, and we read all the glosses and the concordances and things like
that. Yeah. I took a seminar in grad school in Joyce, and you had to have read the Portrait of the Artist or whatever, and Dubliners, and the only books that we did were Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, and we read Ulysses like you would any normal book, and we go through chapter by chapter, and people would have the thing, and then it got to Finnegan's Wake, and he said, okay. There is no way to read this book.
Just pick it up anywhere. Okay.
All we're going to do is I'm going to put it in the middle, and somebody grab it and pick it up a random page. And it is just it's a strange sort of kind of high octane reading environment. It's almost, it's like a club that you have to kind of enter into with. You sort of have to read it with a quorum of people. You know, you can't just read it by yourself.
Yeah, and I have all these. I collect Joyceana and have first editions of the Shakespeare and Company and Finnegan's Wake and the limited edition club book. But the funniest thing was I have this read copy of Finnegan's Wake, and it has a boy blowing a bugle on the cover. And my 3-year-old daughter and I used to lie in bed, and she called it Pretzel Boy because the bugle says the book was renamed Pretzel Boy, and which would have been just as good. And we would just open it up, and I would read it aloud to her. But you have to read it with an Irish accent, and I would only do it with her because I was too embarrassed. And, but she was 3 years old, and she had just learned how to read, and she could actually read it because it was kind of gibberish, so she could actually read the book, which was kind of almost like a moment of epiphany for me.
Yeah, I think that he somehow was able to like make the most intelligent book in the world be also the most impenetrable book also be the most universal book, because exactly, like, children can read it and understand like things in it. Like someone that is just learning English could spot, oh, that's dog, or that's, bark, or there's, I'm seeing words in it. But then, a bunch of, erudite grad students can get in there and find all these other, meanings and all this other stuff. It's great. There's a New York's Joyce Society that I would go to that would meet in homes and like, apartments in the West Village, and these old Irishmen, some of them that had memorized large portions, too many portions of Finnegan's Wake, that they would recite aloud, and then have conversations, and scholars, but also, just lovers of Joyce, people that, garbage truck drivers or whatever, like just people. It's a fascinating work. It's a headache, but it's beautiful, and it's great.
Yeah, Joyce said something like, "I don't ask much of my readers, just that they spend the rest of their life, trying to understand my books and reading them closely."
The humility.
All right, going back to the book. We've been 20 minutes talking about all kinds of weird things.
Oh yeah.
So we left with Paul. So how come Paul's house is so nice and he's got so much money if his father's like a minister? Unless I'm getting this wrong.
Well, I think there's a kind of prosperity gospel that I was looking at. That being a minister is almost a capitalistic enterprise.
Yeah, definitely.
On how well you were doing it. Maybe you were tucking some money back here and there in various places. So I think that's where I was kind of envisioning him. Their church is really small, and maybe there's the kind of whisper of that, but yeah, I think there's always been a weird parallel between religion and business. It was always very strange to me,
That guy Joel Osteen, is that his name?
Yeah.
I mean, he got like $5 million in PPP money, and I'm thinking that makes no sense at all.
Right. He was also, I think he also, I can't remember. I think he's in Texas. One of the hurricanes, one of the floods. They were opening up a lot of places, and he couldn't open his spot. Yeah. So it's these people are terrible.
But it is generally, as you said, in the South. Yeah, generally it is, I think, for the most part.
That kind of event. Well, I think there's definitely
right, California, the Crystal Cathedral and all that.
Well, there's that. Yeah, like Orange County is very evangelical, but I mean, you can find pockets of evangelicalism all over the country. I mean, the South obviously has got a corner on the market, but particularly those kinds of preachers, they own private jets and things, that sort of
stuff. That's true.
Yeah. But there's, for every one of those, there's little ones everywhere. That's the kind of upstart Joel Osteen or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so like going back to the book. So, Iggy goes to rehab and does some of his little tricks. And then Cleo goes to this cult community. And it's interesting how they both veered off into those things, not necessarily willingly. Actually, I don't know. Well, yeah, I do know for Iggy, but I don't know for Cleo. And it's interesting how you set those two out there, basically because they didn't know, again, just like everything else, they didn't really know what to do. So this is just something else you could do.
Right. Yeah, I think like, we don't have a robust welfare state in America. Like there is nothing undergirding a lot of our society. And for certain people, when they reach a rock bottom, there's not many places you can go to. And that's why people go to cults, I think, a lot. I mean, they go to cults for a lot of different reasons, but one of them is that they have nowhere else to go. And that's a reason why people go to church too. So not always, but, oftentimes these people can be exploited or that's just that, like you're saying, the only place they could go. And that's where they end up,
Well, let's go to the final section, because you alluded to it earlier, and a lot of you just talk about how you ended up there. So if we talk about Joe, I'm growing up now. How did you decide that was where you were going to end up? Why?
I think I wanted to echo off of Iggy that these two characters were kind of two billiard balls, hitting and splitting off, and that I am interested in that kind of transference, where in fiction, like not in any sort of literal way, but in a sort of metaphysical fabric of space-time that is within the little confines of the book, Iggy kind of becomes Joe in a way. Joe is dispirited and alienated in a similar way. But his experiences were able to stop him from becoming Iggy. And he avoids that. He attempts to kill himself at one point and veers away. So yeah, I thought I would end with Joe's chapter. I'm almost positive the shortest chapter in the book.
Yeah.
And acts as a kind of as a point to which to look backwards on all of a sort of precipice to see the kind of last ring of the echo after what this event has done to the town, and he's sort of the last gasp of that story. And I think I was probably thinking, in The Sound and the Fury, that last section is given to Dilsey, but it's told in a third-person narration. And I wanted to kind of, by using that first-person narration, echo, kind of plug in that the Iggy connection was there, but also to give another sort of farewell, although we don't know, it's not explicit whether Joe is dying or that he is just at the end of something. So yeah, he's kind of a final precipice, kind of final look at all the events that have happened.
So in conclusion, like I said, the book's on the front table, and one thing I've learned as a bookseller is that as many times as I've heard, you can't judge a book by its cover. Everybody that comes to a bookstore judges every book by its cover.
Yeah, of course.
So I see you got. Can you show us the cover up close? I see you have it back. Yeah. So this is the kind that obviously attracts readers. Did you get to vet it? Did you choose one out of many, or how did you?
Well, that's the one thing. Melville House is a wonderful publisher, and it's full of smart people, and I love everybody that I work with, and they're very flexible in a lot of things. And And, you know, a lot of publishers won't let you publish these wacky little books, you know, and they take a great chance on me, and I appreciate everything they do. But the one thing that they stand by are their covers, and they have a great in-house art team, but they made this and I loved it. So that was all them. I have very little say in any of it, and they're great. So yeah.
It's so funny. Some of the authors tell me that the reason is because you want to sell your book. And,
yeah.
And that's for good or for bad. That's what sells books.
Yeah.
You know? They have certain motifs, whether it's a chick book or a mystery or science fiction, and you're drawn to that. It's just really funny how that works.
Yeah, I know. I used to think about the psychology of like book covers a lot when I would work on the floor of a bookstore. Like what color books sell more, or like you know, like do women buy more red books or you know, yellow books, or like that was something somebody would always say, like, oh, yellow books don't sell, and then like there would be a yellow book one year that would just be, I don't know. Then you start to see like motifs, and like one year there'll be like 5 like flying horse books, or like, you know, like you know, like
Winter's Tale.
yeah.
Yeah, it was the way I find it is like I've counted like 40 books that have the word girl in it, like the girl with the dragon tattoo, the girl who fell from this, the girl on a train, Gone Girl. But there's like, I can count 40 of them. And now I know from interviewing people that almost every book, well, obviously nonfiction, has a colon and a subtitle.
Oh yeah.
So it's like, yeah, definitely. Yeah. I'm trying to find one here. But yeah, they all have subtitles. And that seems to be like the current fad. But be that as it may. So anyway, all I was going to say was, yes, it's out there. And you talked about a curated bookstore. So I've already seen Mike and Angie picking it up. My daughter, who works there, is the best, because she'll go out from behind the counter. She'll grab the book and she goes, "You have to buy it." Because you have to.
That's the best thing. Yeah. I think I have a friend down in Mississippi, the writer Mary Miller, who, if you don't know her, you should. She's a great author. But she had a little book that came out on a small press, Hobart Long Flight Short Drive, I think it's called.
Yeah.
And it was a little book, her first collection. She's published a number of novels, short stories, but it was, you know, a little book. And I would put it up right by the register with a shelf talker. And inevitably somebody would be buying, you know, books, waiting for me to ring it up, and they would pick it up and kind of read it. They'd read the shelf talker, and I would say, "That's really good," you know, and they go, "Oh," and I sort of explain, you know, this author, da 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 da, and they would just throw it on the top of the pile, you know.
I know.
It was that sort of psychology of going, you know, I know what you want.
Yeah, I know. It's like the end cap Target, or when you wait in line at Home Goods and you have to look at everything as you're going out. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The impulse buy. Yeah.
Well, anyway, thank you so much, Michael, for coming on today. It's fun talking to you about the book and about all these other things. I hope I didn't stray too far.
No, not at all. I love it. Yeah, it's great to talk about it. So, but I hope to see you in the bookstore in person someday soon. I would love to get down there and just shop and see the bookstore. But it was great to meet you, and thanks for having me on the show and doing this. It's really great.
Yeah. Next time you come to Philadelphia, just give us a call or email us, and yeah, that'd be great.
Definitely will. Definitely will. Awesome, Sam.
Okay, see you later.
Thanks so much. Take care.